close your eyes. Breathe in the dry, wind-whipped air of the open steppe. Let the scent of horse sweat, felt tense, and boiling mutton drift across your imagination. And listen, not to the gallop of war horses, but to the quiet command of women left behind. The Mongol Empire, land of conquest, of thunderous hooves and burning cities. It's the image history tends to spotlight. Male warriors storming from Asia to Europe like a plague of iron. But that's only half the story. The truth, softly spoken, rarely carved in stone, is that the empire's beating heart did not gallop toward bloodshed. It waited. It whispered. It directed quietly from within the camp, far from the battlefield. Because when Mongol men rode off to war, Mongol women stayed and ruled. Before we go further, if you find yourself gently drifting off to this story of forgotten power, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We have many strange truths still to explore together. And as always, where are you listening from tonight? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from faraway places, just as the Mongols once did. Now, back to the steppe. While you are gone, I'll rule everything. The year is 2020. Genghis Khan is on the move. Cities will fall. Roads will flood with refugees, and walls will crumble beneath siege engines. But back in the homeland, somewhere beneath a felt roof, held down by stones, a woman unfurls a ledger. She is not idle. She is managing property, livestock, servants, marriage negotiations, trade caravans, and laws. When Genghis Khan rode off to conquer half the world, he didn't leave chaos behind. He left it in highly organized female hands. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience. This was planned infrastructure. The Mongol Empire was mobile, yes, but it was not loose. It was held together by an unspoken deal. The men would win abroad. The women would keep everything from falling apart at home. And they didn't just preserve, they ruled. The ger was a throne room. Imagine a ger, the traditional Mongol tent, circular, portable, made of felt, wood, and willpower. Inside, it is warm with the glow of fire and the scent of animal fat. Now imagine who sits in the central position when the men are gone. A Mongol noblewoman does not pace the camp in mourning. She gives orders. The wife of a general may negotiate trade with Muslim merchants. A mother of a Khan might sign off on new laws. A daughter may oversee a diplomatic envoy from a rival tribe. This is not an emergency redistribution of power. This is custom. Mongol women, especially elite women, were educated in governance. They understood land rights, marriage politics, religious tolerance, and tribal diplomacy. And unlike in many other medieval societies, they were expected to use that knowledge. Not a loophole, a system. You might assume this was a loophole, something tolerated out of necessity, a makeshift system until the real rulers came back. But no, this was part of the Mongol legal structure. The yasa, the Mongol code of law, did not explicitly bar women from power. In practice, it allowed flexibility, and power was often measured not in who wore the title, but in who made the decisions. In Mongol aristocracy, women owned herds, commanded camps, and acted as regents. When Genghis Khan's empire expanded beyond what he could personally oversee, who managed the home court? His daughters-in-law, his wives, his mother. Töregene Khan, the second great Khan, even left the empire in the hands of his wife Töregene when he died. For 5 years, she ran the Mongol Empire, and she did it successfully, appointing officials, securing loyalty, and even pushing her son into power. She wasn't acting despite the system. She was the system. Not passive placeholders. Many of these women weren't meek seat-warmers waiting for husbands to return. They were strategists. They managed entire regions, made and broke alliances, and sometimes even manipulated succession. Sorgakhtani Beki, a Christian noblewoman married into Genghis Khan's lineage, educated her sons rigorously. She ensured they learned law, language, and leadership. The result? Her sons ruled over 4 of the major Mongol khanates. She didn't inherit power. She built it, positioned it, and deployed it, all while managing territories. Western chroniclers often missed this. They looked for queens in towers, not women in yurts. But inside those felt walls, policies were being drafted, armies were being supplied, and power was being spun, thread, by the women left behind. And let's talk economy. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on gold alone. It was built on livestock, land, and logistics. And who controlled all 3 while the men waged war? Women. They oversaw pastures, herd migrations, the allocation of grazing zones, and even the production and redistribution of fermented mare's milk, a crucial economic and cultural product. In many cases, men returned home to find women had reorganized everything for the better. This meant that women could withhold resources, redirect trade, and reshape loyalty within clans. They weren't just caretakers, they were the reason anything still existed to return to. And a silent political network. While Mongol men conquered cities and erected victory walls, Mongol women crafted networks. These weren't just familial. They were political alliances woven through marriage, milk kinship, yes, that was a thing, and trust. Women arranged the marriages of children from different tribes, cemented trade between regions, and stabilized areas recently annexed. These weren't background roles. They were soft power structures with real consequences. Mongol men may have lit the fires of war, but the women kept the wind blowing in the right direction. So tonight, as you close your eyes beneath your own ceiling, imagine instead a felt roof, a warm hearth, and a woman writing letters to a governor 400 miles away, sealed in her name. She's not waiting. She's not forgotten. She's running everything. While history rides off in search of the battle, remember who managed the aftermath. The Mongol world wasn't merely built by warriors. It was sustained by women, steady, strategic, often invisible to history's louder tales. And that's where we begin.
Let's pause here, not on the battlefield, not on a galloping horse with blood on the saddle. Let's pause in a place history tends to glance past, the camp that doesn't move. Because while Mongol armies roared across Asia and into Europe, a different kind of power was unfolding at home, one that didn't ride, didn't conquer, and didn't shout. It simply stayed, and in staying, it controlled everything that moved. Stillness as strategy. In Mongol culture, movement was survival. Nomadic life required it, following grazing patterns, chasing seasons, avoiding famine. And yet, in every campaign, there came a moment when someone had to stay behind. Not just anyone. Women. But this staying wasn't passive. It was a strategic stillness. Because the heart of the empire, its wealth, its supply chains, its internal politics, didn't ride with the army. It stayed behind in the camp, and whoever controlled the camp controlled the war. Maps without borders. Mongol women knew geography differently. They didn't need imperial maps. They had grazing routes memorized, water sources catalogued, trade routes negotiated over years of soft diplomacy. They knew who owed what to whom. They knew which herds needed rotating, which tribes were restless, which sons were scheming for power. In many ways, they knew more than the generals, because generals operated on the battlefield, but wives, mothers, and daughters governed the infrastructure of conquest. You can't fuel a cavalry without food. You can't field a war band without tents, fodder, and coordination. You can't send messages if the woman at home controls the riders. They didn't just survive in the shadows, they cast them. Herds were currency, and women controlled them. In the Mongol world, herds weren't just animals, they were currency. Horses, sheep, goats, camels, these weren't domestic luxuries, they were the backbone of the economy. Who fed the warriors' families? Who decided how many horses were available for battle? Who dealt with the merchants when it came time to trade wool, leather, milk, and hides? The women did. And they didn't merely take inventory. They made decisions, economic, strategic, and political, about how wealth flowed. A noblewoman with 3,000 head of livestock wasn't a background figure. She was a power broker. A different kind of authority. Western chroniclers were baffled. How could a society so centered on conquest allow women such visibility? Because Mongol authority wasn't shaped by stone palaces and inheritance laws. It was shaped by necessity. You can't send a Khan across the continent for 2 years and expect life to freeze at home. So instead of freezing, women ran things. And the longer the men were gone, the more entrenched women became in decision-making. Some even grew to prefer it, and many Mongol men trusted it. Invisible threads of control. Let's take a step deeper. Imagine a young Mongol woman whose husband has left to fight in Persia. He's gone for 18 months. In that time, she oversees the relocation of the family herd, negotiates grazing rights with a rival clan, decides when to move the winter camp, sends 2 letters to allied families arranging a marriage, trades fermented mare's milk with Chinese merchants, settles a dispute between cousins over inheritance. None of this is ceremonial. It is power. It is control. And when her husband returns, he may still hold the sword, but she holds the stability. Mobility through memory. Power in Mongol society didn't depend on physical buildings or permanent structures. It depended on memory, on relationships, agreements, routes, and rituals. Women often remembered what men forgot. Which trader cheated last spring? Which cousin started a feud? Which shaman warned about a cursed pasture? This memory became a form of governance. They weren't just caretakers of livestock, they were caretakers of order. The legal grey zone. Unlike more rigid empires, the Mongol legal structure allowed for fluidity. While it was male-dominated at the top, it did not systematically bar women from acting in positions of leadership, especially when no men were present. This meant that women were able to serve as regents, sign trade documents, negotiate tribal conflicts, represent their households in legal matters. Even commoner women, those not married to khans or generals, could wield local influence in family councils or inter-clan negotiations. They weren't voting in parliaments, but they were guiding decisions, and often their words stuck. Power through stillness. So what does it mean to hold power by staying still? It means knowing the landscape better than the army that marches through it, managing resources the soldiers will later rely on, making decisions when no one else is around to object, and slowly and steadily becoming indispensable. The Mongol woman did not draw swords. She did not raise banners. She didn't need to. Because when war ended and the warriors came home, she was already seated at the center of the world they hoped to reclaim. And in some ways, they had to ask it back.
Let's shift the felt curtain back just a little further, because if you thought Mongol women were only background administrators while men conquered the known world, well, you've not yet met the daughters of Genghis Khan. History prefers the thunder of hooves and the clash of empires, but between the raids, the sieges, and the flames, a different legacy took root. One woven not through swords, but through marriages, alliances, diplomacy, and control. It was Genghis' daughters, not just his sons, who ensured the Mongol Empire held together. And for a time, they may have wielded more power than any general on horseback. Queens, not just brides, rulers. In most empires, daughters were married off like trinkets, tokens of diplomacy, passed from throne to throne. In the Mongol world, daughters were weapons, tools of diplomacy, but also territorial governors. Let's take Alokai Beki, one of Genghis Khan's daughters. She was married to a prince of the Ongud tribe as part of a strategic alliance. But this wasn't a passive bride ceremony. Genghis placed her in command of the region, militarily and politically. She became the de facto governor of that part of the empire. She issued orders, oversaw troops, and managed tax collection. And here's the crucial part. The tribe she ruled was not allowed to replace her if she died. Her title would pass to another Mongol woman. That was the arrangement. Why? Because Genghis didn't trust anyone with power. He trusted his daughters. The daughters' empire. Genghis had many daughters, and we only know the names of a few because later male historians didn't bother to record them. But from what little we do know, it's clear. He used his daughters to stabilize and hold newly conquered territories. While his sons expanded outward, his daughters formed a kind of internal net, holding things together from within. Imagine it. One daughter rules over an allied tribe in the west. Another manages border politics in the north. A third oversees trade routes in the south. These women weren't waiting for their husbands' instructions. They were issuing their own. Töregene and the throne. Now, let's step forward a generation to one of the most fascinating figures in Mongol history, Töregene Khatun. She was the widow of Töregene Khan, Genghis's successor, and she did something very few women in history managed to do. She ruled the Mongol Empire outright for 5 full years, not as a silent regent, not as a hidden influencer, but as a sovereign in practice. When Töregene died in 1241, Töregene took over the imperial court. She replaced her husband's advisors with her own. She appointed new governors. She coordinated military campaigns, and she orchestrated the rise of her son, Guyuk, to become the next great Khan. In a patriarchal warrior society, she ran the empire, and nobody stopped her. Soft power, hard results. Töregene wasn't alone. Another Mongol queen, Töregene Beki,
wielded power quietly but just as effectively. She was an Nestorian Christian, highly educated, fluent in politics, and a master of diplomacy. Rather than claiming power through loud declarations, she moved like water, supporting her sons, building alliances, and making sure her branch of the family came out on top. Her efforts resulted in her son, Kublai Khan, ruling the Yuan dynasty in China. If you've ever heard the name Kublai, you're already seeing the effects of her political genius. And again, this wasn't rebellion, this was custom. Mongol society, especially under Genghis's original structure, allowed this kind of flexibility because it worked. Political wives or hidden emperors. Let's revisit a quiet scene. Imagine a Mongol princess standing beside her husband, a local tribal chief. He gives a speech. He welcomes envoys. He pours the first cup of erag, fermented mare's milk. But she's the one who organizes the diplomatic message, approves the trade terms, orders the distribution of supplies, and decides who marries whom next. To outsiders, she looks like a wife. To insiders, she's the axis of power. Diplomatic webs woven by women. The empire's success wasn't only military, it was relational. The daughters of Genghis and their daughters after them wove marriage alliances that connected dozens of tribes, ethnicities, and former enemies. This web of political unions was far more stable than conquest alone. A sword can take a city, but only relationships can hold it. And in the Mongol world, those relationships were managed not just by generals, but by women who knew how to balance kinship and ambition. The business of empire. These women didn't just handle diplomacy, they handled money. Many of them oversaw trade networks, pasture taxes, Silk Road tolls, and market exchanges. They acted as economic governors, not just symbolic figureheads. In fact, some Mongol women minted their own coins, bearing their names or insignias. That's not metaphorical power. That's real, stamped public authority. And yes, the men still fought, but the empire's day-to-day function rested heavily in female hands. What was their private life like? You might ask, did these powerful women also live lives of domestic quiet? Did they raise children, spin wool, cook meals? And the answer is yes and no. Elite Mongol women were expected to ride horses, fire bows, manage yurts, raise children, and govern entire regions if necessary. They were multi-role figures, navigating public and private spheres simultaneously. They could settle a tribal dispute in the morning and host a birth celebration that evening. They lived in worlds where leadership and family life were not separate, but layered. Empire held by quiet hands. So as you lie back and imagine the Mongol Empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, don't let your mind drift only to the galloping hooves and blood-stained warriors. Think of the daughter at the campfire, the widow at the ledger, the queen in the tent with the quiet eyes who says nothing but ensures everything moves her way. The empire expanded with fire, but it endured with women.
Marriage as a weapon, the Mongol matrimonial strategy. Let's dim the campfire a little and listen closely, because while war drums thundered across the steppe, Mongol women were making quieter, far more enduring moves through marriage. Not the kind with flowers and vows. The Mongol version of marriage was often a weapon, wielded with precision. Forget romance, forget love songs. This was strategy, political, economic, and territorial, and no one knew how to wield it better than Mongol women. Marriage as power transfer. In many ancient societies, marriage was used to seal alliances. The Mongols took that idea and made it central to their entire empire-building machine. Marrying a daughter into a rival clan wasn't about unity, it was about absorption. Because once a Mongol woman married into your family, she didn't disappear. She brought her own servants, her own wealth, her father's military protection, and her own expectations for control. You didn't marry a Mongol princess to gain a bride, you married her to survive. And in many cases, her loyalty was still to the Khan. Bride as governor. Many Mongol women weren't just sent away, they were installed. A marriage could place a Mongol princess or noblewoman in charge of a key territory. She'd mediate tribal disputes, collect taxes, serve as the empire's diplomatic representative. And if her husband died, she didn't go home. She often stayed and ruled. In some cases, her children inherited, ensuring Mongol influence remained locked in. This meant that while men expanded the empire through war, women entrenched it through family. The marriage of politics and patriarchy. Let's not pretend Mongol society was utopian. Women still existed within a male-dominated framework. Marriages were often arranged by fathers or uncles. Consent was negotiable. But once inside a marriage, Mongol women wielded unusual degrees of power because their political usefulness didn't end at the altar. They could send diplomatic messages, host envoys, oversee land allocations, influence succession within their new families. A single, well-placed woman could ensure decades of Mongol dominance in a region without drawing a sword. Letters across borders. One of the most fascinating traces of Mongol matrimonial power is found in correspondence. Letters between mothers and sons, sisters and brothers, wives and khans reveal a network of women actively managing trade, military logistics, political pressure, inheritance conflicts. These weren't emotional exchanges, they were bureaucratic blueprints with affection tucked behind strategic phrasing. And they revealed just how much influence Mongol women retained, even when separated by mountains, borders, or husbands. The plural wives system. It's important to note Mongol men, especially nobles, married more than once. Polygamy was common, but not all wives were equal. The first wife held legal and ritual supremacy. She often controlled the household. Her children were first in line. Second and third wives might manage satellite camps or specific herds, but the first wife, she was the one that mattered. Many Mongol women ensured that they became first wives, not by birth, but by clever political maneuvering. And once they secured that position, they rarely let go. Divorce? Sort of. In some cases, Mongol women could leave marriages, particularly if their families remained powerful. And while formal divorce wasn't always an option, separation was not unheard of, especially if the marriage no longer served political purpose. More interestingly, if a Mongol woman's husband died, she didn't vanish into widowhood. She often inherited her husband's estate, including yurts, animals, and responsibilities. In some cases, she was even married to her late husband's brother, not out of love, but to maintain her position and power. Marriage diplomacy beyond the steppe. The Mongols didn't limit their marital strategy to their own tribes. They married into Chinese dynasties, Persian nobility, Russian princes, Central Asian khanates. And in every case, the Mongol bride was expected to monitor loyalty, send reports, influence local policy, protect Mongol interests. This wasn't assimilation.
It was surveillance through silk and ceremony. Romantic love? Rare, but not absent. While most Mongol marriages were arranged, some women still wielded enough power to choose their husbands or refuse them. In a few rare records, Mongol princesses rejected suitors, delayed marriage, or fell in love and made politically risky choices. These were exceptions, but they mattered. They reveal that personal agency, while limited, was not erased, and in certain cases, a powerful woman could bend tradition to her will, especially if her family needed her cooperation. Marriage as subtle empire. Let's think differently for a moment. We often imagine empires built by men on horses, kings in castles, generals with maps. But the Mongol Empire was held together by letters between sisters, women who stayed in place, marriages that carried military weight. Each bride was a message. We're watching. We are here now. We are part of you. And once a Mongol woman was inside your family, you didn't just gain an ally. You gained a proxy for empire. Household power, running the empire from the yurt. Let's step quietly into the warmth of a Mongol yurt. The early light spills through the circular roof hole, just enough to reveal wool blankets folded with care, carved wooden cups still damp from fermented milk, and the quiet hum of responsibility beginning again. No horns, no banners, just the steady rhythm of a woman preparing her household to function, and not just function, but lead. Because out here on the steppes, long after the men had ridden off with war banners fluttering, it was often the women who held everything together. From livestock to diplomacy, supply routes to marriages, the Mongol home was not just a domestic space. It was a seat of government, and the woman at its center, a quiet and firm administrator of an empire within an empire. Herds, hides, and household economy. Start with the obvious, animals. The Mongol economy was built on pastoralism, herds of sheep, goats, yaks, horses, and camels. And those herds didn't manage themselves. When the men went to war, it was women who counted and rotated the herds, handled shearing, milking, birthing, and butchering, bartered wool, hides, and fermented mare's milk for other goods, ensured grazing rights were respected and maintained. They didn't just feed the household, they fed the warriors at war. They kept the wheels turning. And if one herd wandered too far, that wasn't just a domestic issue, it could unravel months of supply lines. In many ways, women were running the empire's logistical backbone, from a saddle, or from a tent flap, or while mending clothing by firelight. The yurt as administrative office. Now let's reimagine the yurt, not as a quaint nomadic hut, but as a mobile command center. Inside, Mongol women stored official records and family lineages, administered marriages and inheritance claims, organized seasonal migrations, managed dowries, taxes, and trade agreements. The yurt was filled with quiet authority. Women did not need to shout. They didn't need a throne. They had the center of the household fire, and from there, power radiated outward in all directions. You didn't just walk into a Mongol woman's home. You entered a space that could influence political alliances, war strategies, and trade routes. And if her husband was away, you addressed her as you would him. The hidden literacy of steppe women. Contrary to popular belief, Mongol women, especially noble ones, were not illiterate. They were taught to read and write in the Uyghur script, to keep written inventories and herding logs, to record treaties and trade agreements, to communicate with officials far across the empire. In fact, many of the surviving documents from the Mongol Empire bear signs of female authorship, especially household reports, diplomatic correspondences, and land agreements. In a society built on mobility, literacy was a tool of stability, and women wielded it with quiet expertise. While men sent messengers by horse, Mongol women sent messages across generations with ink and memory. Textile power, the politics of weaving. Let's not underestimate what we'd call women's work. Spinning wool, weaving blankets, stitching clothes. These weren't just chores. They were acts of economic power. A well-woven tent lining meant insulation for a year. A beautiful robe woven from yak wool could secure a valuable trade. A ceremonial sash could influence a marriage negotiation. Textiles carried status, diplomacy, and meaning, and Mongol women were the keepers of that visual language. They embroidered family signs. They dyed wool with symbolic colors. They wrapped new brides in meaning before they ever opened their mouths. And in every stitch was a message. We are here. We are watching. We endure. Fermentation and negotiation. Want to understand real power? Look at the kitchen. Mongol women managed the creation of fermented mare's milk, irag, dried meat stores, smoked cheeses, root preserves, medicinal pastes. They prepared battle rations, food for ambassadors, and offerings for sacred ceremonies. And when trade envoys arrived, it was women who prepared the symbolic meals, choosing what would be served, in what quantity, and in what vessels. A slightly watered-down irag sent a subtle political message. A rich cheese from a prized goat communicated honor. Refusing a dish altogether, that was a declaration of insult. This wasn't food, it was diplomacy, and the women preparing it knew exactly what they were doing. Navigating power in a male-dominated culture. Now let's pause. We should not romanticize this. Mongol women operated within a patriarchal world. There were limits, there were expectations, there were men who dismissed them, ignored them, or punished them for stepping too far. But Mongol women were not powerless, because Mongol society was mobile and survival-oriented. Competence often outweighed gender. If a woman could keep the animals alive, maintain the tents, organize migrations, feed the extended family, and handle visiting officials, then she was respected, quietly and effectively. And many Mongol men knew that dismissing her would unravel their own legacy. Warrior training at home. And here's something even more fascinating. Some women were also trained in horseback riding, archery, herd defense, and emergency battlefield aid. Because when you're managing a camp, you don't wait for help. There are stories of women who defended their households during raids, led small bands of warriors, trained their children in basic military skills, intervened in tribal disputes with more authority than the nearest man. Power in the Mongol world wasn't only physical, but sometimes it was, and women trained for it. The Campfire Council. One of the most intimate and powerful places in the Mongol Empire was the evening campfire, after the animals were fed, after the scrolls were stored, after the children were sleeping. Women would gather around the fire, sisters, aunts, neighbors, widows, and they would trade updates from distant cousins, discuss food storage and grazing conditions, negotiate future marriages, debate rumors about tribal politics. No official titles, no banners, but here under the stars the future was shaped, and tomorrow's decisions would echo what was whispered beside the flames. Empire from the shadows. So when we think about the Mongol Empire, its reach, its brutality, its genius, we often look at maps and battles. But there is another map, a quieter one. It charts the number of wool sacks spun in a month, the frequency of grazing rotations, the lineage of a daughter's dowry, the reliability of a milk trader from the east. And at the center of that map, a woman. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't ride into war. But if she disappears, so does the empire. Because when the men left, they expected to return to full herds, intact homes, political stability, loyal allies. And all of that, all of it, depended on the quiet governance of the Mongol woman at home.
Widows, regents, and ghost rulers, the women who govern in their husbands' names. A Khan falls in battle. His banner crumples in blood-soaked dust. Whispers of succession ripple through the steppe, and while the men argue, she steps into his seat. Not dramatically, not with a coronation, but with a steady hand on the reins he left behind. And she rules, quietly, sometimes in his name, sometimes in her own. Mongol women were not just the wives of warriors, they were rulers, administrators, and placeholders for power, and sometimes they never gave it back. Let's unfold the story of the women who did not simply survive war and widowhood, they turned it into political ascendancy. When the Khan did not return, the Mongol world was shaped by constant movement. Husbands left for campaigns, sons rode to distant conquests, fathers died far from home, and in their absence, a vacuum. But Mongol society did not collapse when a man died. Instead, it turned, often seamlessly, towards the woman who had already been running everything else. She had managed the household, she had maintained the alliances, she knew the ledgers, the scrolls, the marriage ties, and suddenly she became the voice of continuity. Not just a grieving widow, but a regent, one who now controlled lands, managed succession disputes, issued decrees in the late Khan's name, represented her family at tribal councils, and sometimes became the de facto ruler of a region. She wore no crown, but she didn't need one. Töregene Khatun, the ultimate ghost ruler. Let's meet one of the most powerful women in Mongol history, Töregene Khatun, widow of Töregene Khan. When her husband died in 1241, the empire stood at its peak, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, and chaos loomed. Succession was not guaranteed, factions were forming, and the heirs were not ready. So Töregene stepped in, not as a queen, but as the acting ruler of the Mongol Empire. For 5 full years she governed the entire empire. She appointed generals, replaced ministers, negotiated with foreign dignitaries, expanded influence into Persia and Central Asia. Her name was not officially placed on royal inscriptions, but everyone knew who was really in charge. She orchestrated the selection of her son Guyuk as the next great Khan. But even then, after his coronation, her influence did not entirely vanish. Töregene was not an exception. She was a template. Töregene Beki, a Christian Karaite princess and one of the most respected women of the Mongol era. She married Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. They had 4 sons, including Kublai Khan, who would later rule China. But Tolui died early, and Töregene, she did not fade into retirement. Instead, she raised her sons with an intense political education, built a wide alliance network among Mongol elites,
outmaneuvered other wives and in-laws, positioned her sons for rulership without warfare. By the time Guyok Khan died, yes, Töregene's son, Sorhaktani had already secured a power base. She arranged for her son Monka to become Great Khan, and then her other sons rose. Kublai in the east, Hulegu in Persia. The Mongol world had no formal empress titles, but if it did, she'd wear it, and not as a decorative queen, but as a strategist. One historian later wrote, "No woman ever commanded more respect among the Mongols." The quiet mechanisms of female regency. These women weren't ruling by accident. They were trained, prepared, positioned, and they governed through kinship networks, marriages, sister alliances, cousin pacts, religious legitimacy, Buddhist, Christian, and shamanic endorsements, economic power, control of trade, grain storage, livestock wealth, cultural fluency, understanding Persian court traditions, Chinese bureaucracy, steppe customs. They operated with subtlety. Rarely did they challenge male authority directly. They did not need to. They worked within the system and bent it quietly around themselves. In official records, you might still see the dead husband's name, but the hand signing decrees? Hers. Ghost signatures, real power. In some documents you will find curious phrasing, "on behalf of the late Khan," "in honor of the ancestors," "by the will of heaven," "through the house of Ogede." These were ghost signatures, formal ways to wield authority without appearing to seize it. Mongol women became masters of this linguistic veil. Their power was real, but often framed as preservation of their husband's wishes. This not only preserved male ego, but gave them cover from rival factions. If something went wrong, it was merely caretaking. If something went right, well, the ancestors had surely smiled on them. Smart politics disguised in grief. Maternal power in succession. In Mongol culture, motherhood wasn't a weakness, it was an asset. A Khatun, a royal wife who had birthed sons, had real leverage. She could control their education, arrange their betrothals, choose their mentors, influence their political appointments, delay or accelerate their rise to power. This gave her enormous say in shaping the next generation of Khans. Some historians refer to this as dynastic motherhood, a role in which maternal figures literally designed the future of the empire. And if a rival son tried to rise, it was often the mother who cut him down, quietly, efficiently. Court women and regional governance. The court was not just made of one queen and her ladies, it was layered. Primary wives, often politically arranged, secondary wives, sometimes native nobles, concubines, influential in their own right, dowager Khatun, widows of former rulers, advisors, midwives, scribes, and attendants. Many of these women governed regions in the name of their sons or late husbands. They collected taxes, administered justice, hosted foreign ambassadors, oversaw temples and religious funding. One Persian court observer wrote with mild shock, "Their ladies issue orders as if they were kings." Indeed. The soft tools of rule. What made their rule effective wasn't brute force, it was consistency, knowledge, and trust. They were reliable, wise, familiar faces during times of chaos. While rival male claimants often brought war, the presence of a ruling widow meant stability. And for an empire constantly expanding, stability was gold. It's no surprise that Mongol generals and governors often preferred negotiating with these women. They didn't posture, they didn't burn bridges. They governed like someone holding the family together, because they were. When they let go, and when they didn't. Eventually, some of these women passed the reins to sons or nephews, and quietly stepped aside. Others didn't. They remained in place, even after new Khans rose. They became senior advisors, matriarchs, guardians of memory. They whispered in ears, They corrected missteps. They shaped court culture. And some, especially those with no living sons, continued to rule small regions outright until their death. They became immovable. Like the felt walls of the yurt, they had once been flexible, but once reinforced and weathered, they became unshakable. Legacy of the ghost rulers. What do we make of them now? History often forgets those who ruled quietly, those who didn't demand statues or monuments. But Mongol women did not need marble. Their legacy is carved into imperial decisions, surviving scrolls, shifting alliances, and the stability of an empire that should have collapsed under its own weight. They were regents, mothers, educators, governors, ghost rulers. And without them, the Mongol Empire might have died not with a bang, but a whimper. One poorly timed succession crisis away from disintegration. But it didn't, because while the men were at war, the women governed in silence. And when the men died, the women governed in memory.
Love, loyalty, and leverage, marriage as a political weapon. A Mongol wedding was rarely about love. It was about strategy, loyalty, territory, and sometimes betrayal. The bride might be 13, the groom a distant cousin, or worse, a rival, and yet the union was celebrated with fermented mare's milk and solemn ritual, because in the Mongol Empire marriage wasn't personal, it was political architecture, a carefully placed tent peg in the vast fabric of tribal diplomacy. And no one knew how to use it better than Mongol women. The strategic bride. Let's start with a simple question. Why did Genghis Khan marry off his daughters so widely? Not because he was fond of grand weddings, not because he wanted his daughters settled, but because each daughter became a governor, a subtle diplomat, a tether of Mongol control in volatile territory. Genghis didn't just hand out brides, he planted political anchors. For example, his daughter Alakai Beki was married to the prince of the Ongud tribe. Once married, she didn't just live passively in her new land, she ruled. She handled military garrisons, managed alliances, and helped suppress rebellions. This pattern repeated. Daughters were married to powerful local rulers who were then sent off to distant battlefields. And who was left behind to run things? The daughter. She was no longer just a daughter, she was the governor. Marriage as a weapon. It sounds strange to modern ears, but sending a daughter to marry someone was a preemptive strike, not of violence, of influence. Once married into a tribe, the Mongols could call on that tribe for troops, monitor any signs of rebellion, station loyal envoys through the daughter's retinue, and slowly reshape the tribe's internal politics. If the tribe betrayed them, it wasn't just politics, it was personal, an insult to the Khan's bloodline. So betrayal was rare. Even more striking, if the daughter was widowed, she often remained in power. She didn't return home, she ruled. The rise of daughter governors. Let's return to Alakai Beki for a moment. After her husband died, she didn't relinquish control. She continued ruling her assigned territory with firm hands. Reports from Chinese and Persian chroniclers show she maintained a small military force, negotiated trade routes, presided over legal matters, and defended her province against incursions. She was not an anomaly. She was a model. In fact, many scholars now believe Genghis Khan intentionally trained his daughters to act as regional rulers, far from the central court, but deeply embedded in the fabric of the empire. Some called them shadow khatuns, rulers in form and function, though not always in title. Polygamy, power, and jealous alliances. The Mongol aristocracy practiced polygamy. A powerful man might have multiple wives, a chief wife, the primary political match, several secondary wives, usually from lesser noble clans, concubines, and attendants. This created a complex web of influence. Chief wives often had the most political leverage, but secondary wives could rise through cunning or producing favored sons. Intrigues, rivalries, and whisper campaigns abounded. For women, marriage was not the end of ambition. It was often the beginning. Being a wife meant controlling servants, access to trade goods, influence over family appointments, occasional command of military detachments. Women formed their own informal courts, micro-networks of loyalty, spies, and favors. And while Mongol men were away, the women didn't just wait, they maneuvered. Marriage as leverage in diplomacy. When the Mongols expanded westward into Islamic and Christian territories, they used marriage diplomacy as a soft entry point. They sent envoys saying, "We do not seek war, let us bind families." Sometimes this meant accepting foreign princesses. Other times it meant offering Mongol noblewomen as wives to local leaders. But these weren't passive exchanges. Each bride came with a caravan of attendants, gifts and records, expectations of loyalty, and sometimes written instructions from the Khan. In regions like Persia, Syria, and the Caucasus, Mongol brides subtly shifted court dynamics, favoring pro-Mongol advisors, appointing familiar alliances, and pressing for treaties that served the steppe. They were not spies, they were stakeholders. Forbidden love and deadly affairs. Of course, not all marriages were arranged, not all love stories were clean. And when Mongol women chose their own lovers outside the sanctioned channels, things got dangerous. Among the upper elite, a woman caught in an unsanctioned affair could be banished, imprisoned, even executed. But power protects. A few high-ranking women defied expectations. Some took lovers while their husbands were away. Others used rumors of relationships to manipulate court factions. A few even used forbidden relationships to shift alliances, starting minor rebellions or forcing diplomatic concessions. Love in the Mongol court could be more explosive than war, and often it was the woman who lit the fuse. The marital tent as a political stage. In many Mongol camps, each wife had her own yurt, her own self-contained household, and these yurts became mini-courts, trade hubs, intelligence posts, and sometimes campaign headquarters. A powerful wife could host foreign merchants, hold court over local disputes, manage tax collection, and provide hospitality for envoys. In one Persian source, a Mongol wife's tent was described as a court of silver threads and golden secrets. That wasn't poetry, it was truth. The role of dowager Khatuns. As we have seen, widowed wives didn't always step down. Many became dowager Khatuns, a soft title meaning elder consort or queen mother. These women held tremendous soft power. They advised new khans, managed the education of young nobles, oversaw religious rituals, controlled swathes of wealth and property. They were trusted, feared, and sometimes hated. But they endured. In a world of galloping horses and sudden deaths, a dowager's tent was a pillar of continuity. Case study, Princess Kutulun. Let's now talk about Kutulun, the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan. Though most famous for her wrestling and battlefield skills, her marital life was just as strategic. Her father refused to marry her off lightly. She demanded that any suitor defeat her in a wrestling match. Legend says she beat hundreds. But behind the story is a deeper truth. Her marriage was delayed intentionally to preserve her autonomy. She was not just a daughter, she was a military commander. Her marriage, when it came, was politically optimal, not romantic. She showed that even in elite circles, women could dictate the terms if they had the reputation and leverage. Ritual, emotion, and symbolism. Despite all this pragmatism, Mongol marriages were still deeply ritualized. Ceremonies included drinking bowls passed between families, shared animal sacrifices, robe gifting, fire blessing rituals. These weren't just for show. They encoded the hierarchy of the union. Was it a peer-to-peer alliance? Or was one clan clearly dominant? Who would gain control of which territories? The emotional layer was real too. Many women did care for their husbands. Some suffered when those men died in battle or betrayal. But emotion was always wrapped in function. Love alone rarely dictated fate. A soft web of influence. Marriage among the Mongols was not just a string of unions, it was a web. Each wife, daughter, widow, and mother formed part of a soft structure of governance that bound the empire together, tempered rivalries, stabilized volatile regions, and quietly rewrote maps. This wasn't formal power. It didn't require throne rooms. It was wielded from bedding, tents, and family scrolls, and it was devastatingly effective. Mindfulness, political marriage, Mongol style. So if you ever imagined that Mongol women were passive passengers in an empire of men, think again.
They were engineers of empire, architects of trust, and fierce negotiators of family. Marriage was not just a private affair, it was statecraft, it was espionage, it was empire building. And the women who navigated it did not do so by accident.
Spiritual brokers, women and the supernatural power behind the empire. Before war drums echoed across the steppe, before Khans thundered into cities on horseback, and before alliances were sealed in marriage, something quieter stirred. A whisper, a ritual, a flicker of smoke curling upward from a yurt at dawn. It wasn't a warrior who lit that fire. It wasn't a scribe or general. It was a woman, often elderly, sometimes revered, always essential. Because in the Mongol world, power was not just political or military, it was deeply spiritual, and women were its gatekeepers. Shamans in the shadow of war. Let's start with a word, Udgan. It means female shaman. And in the vast expanse of Mongol belief systems, Udgan held a position of sacred power. They were not side characters. They were interpreters of the divine, brokers between the living and the dead. While male shamans' bow existed and were respected, female shamans were often closer to the hearth, to the ancestors, and to the day-to-day rituals that shaped Mongol lives. They led domestic rituals for protection and fertility, channeled ancestral spirits in healing rites, oversaw childbirth ceremonies, communicated with sky gods and land spirits. When a Mongol prince rode into battle, it was an Udgan who burned incense behind him, asking the spirits to bless or spare his journey. She did not ride with him, but she may have determined his fate. Rituals of the hearth. In Mongol households, the hearth was sacred, and guess who controlled it? Not the father, not the eldest son, the matriarch. She tended the fire not just as a homemaker, but as a spiritual guardian. If the fire died, it was not just inconvenient, it was a bad omen. Each morning, offerings of milk or butter were cast into the flames. Ancestors were invoked softly before meals. Special objects, stones, feathers, beads, were arranged at the altar beside the fire. The woman's role here was not passive. She remembered birthdays of the dead. She knew which ancestor favored which offering. She interpreted the flicker of flame as a message from the beyond. And sometimes, even Khans listened. It's recorded that Genghis Khan himself consulted shamans regularly. Some say he feared one in particular, a woman who lived far from his court, surrounded by bones and birds. She never wore armor, but he trusted her judgment more than any general. The politics of the sacred. Of course, spiritual influence wasn't just mystical, it was strategic. In many cases, women aligned themselves with certain religious factions, promoted shamans who were loyal to their clan, or used spiritual legitimacy to support political coups. Imagine this: a Khan dies suddenly. His sons argue over succession. Then an Udgan steps forward, eyes closed, voice trembling, saying, "The ancestor favors the younger son." That's not just divine insight, that's political intervention. And no man dares argue with the spirits. This wasn't rare, it was a pattern. In moments of instability, women wielded ritual power to sway decisions, delay battles, or legitimize heirs. It was soft control, but it worked. Spiritual objects and symbolism. Let's peek into a woman's traveling pouch. Inside, you'd find a knot of red wool for protection, carved bone charms for health, a tiny mirror to repel evil, dried herbs tied with sinew, perhaps a worn feather once carried by her grandmother. These weren't decorations, they were tools.
Many Mongol women were the spiritual caretakers of their households, and like healers or folk priests in other cultures, they carried symbols of power. These were passed from mother to daughter, not through royal decree, but through whispers, dreams, and practice. Death rites and the female touch. Even death itself required a woman's hand. When someone died, women washed the body, chose the burial gifts, sang the ancestral chants, led the silent procession out of the camp, and later maintained the shrine or memory stone. In many nomadic cultures, death was not a rupture, it was a continuation, and women ensured that continuation flowed smoothly. They were the archivists of memory, the breath behind the ancestor's name. Without them, the dead might wander, and the living might forget. Mongol queens and sacred legitimacy. Let's shift from the hearth to the throne, because queens too used spiritual authority. Take Töregene Khatun, widow of Genghis Khan. After her husband's death, she ruled as regent for 5 years. But she didn't just rely on military might. She built temples, sponsored religious leaders, held court rituals that linked her rule to the will of the ancestors. By associating herself with sacred symbols and ceremonies, Töregene gave her power a cosmic seal of approval. It wasn't enough to say, "I am ruling now." She had to perform that rite through incense, sacrifice, and seasonal ceremony. And it worked. Her reign was accepted not just by court officials, but by the people, because she had the spirits on her side. Fertility, survival, and superstition. Let's not forget the body. Fertility was central to Mongol survival, and women, especially elder women, held tremendous knowledge of birth, miscarriage, and healing. They taught which herbs eased pain, which charms protected a pregnancy, what signs to read in a newborn's first cry. In many households, a midwife was also a spiritual guide. Birth was not just biological, it was metaphysical. It needed blessing, protection, a song, and those blessings, more often than not, came from women. Sorcery and fear. Of course, with power comes suspicion. Women accused of improper sorcery could be banished, silenced, or rarely executed, particularly if they cursed rival families, interfered with military campaigns, or made ill omens too accurate for comfort. This shows us something subtler, that spiritual power was real enough to fear. Even among hardened warlords, the idea of a woman channeling unseen forces could unsettle an entire camp. Many men rode into battle confident, but if an Udgan said, "I saw your death in the coals," they didn't sleep well. Daily life and ritual continuity. Rituals weren't grand, they were constant. Each day, a pinch of milk to the sky, a song while grinding millet, a whispered name while sewing a coat, a quick blessing before saddling a horse. These acts created spiritual continuity, and Mongol women performed them with care, not because they were dramatic, but because they were vital. They anchored the world, quietly, repeatedly, devotedly. Final thoughts. The invisible empire. So let's be clear. When we talk about Mongol women's power, we often imagine political marriages, governing widows, clever diplomacy. But beneath that was something older, more enduring. A spiritual authority that connected generations, interpreted the unseen, and preserved identity in an empire that moved with the wind. These women didn't wear helmets, they didn't issue edicts, but they lit the fire, carried the chants, and whispered the names that held empires together. So next time you hear about steppe warriors, remember, their strength came not just from bows and horses, but from the women who stirred the ashes and asked the sky to listen.
The silent backbone, women's economic power on the steppe. Imagine the winds of the steppe. They are cold, unforgiving, constant. Now imagine a world where men are almost always gone, fighting, raiding, conquering or dying? Who keeps the herds moving? Who handles the trade? Who ensures there's food, wool, and felt for the coming winter? The answer is simple. The women. Always the women. They didn't carry swords, they didn't boast, but Mongol women were the economic engines behind the empire. And unlike in many other medieval societies, their labor wasn't hidden. It was central, respected, and vital. Let's travel gently into the world of quiet, relentless productivity. Herds, horses, and the power of property. The Mongol economy wasn't built on cities or coins. It was built on livestock. Sheep, goats, yaks, horses, and camels. These were living currency, sources of food, clothing, mobility, and trade. And who managed these creatures day to day? Not the warriors galloping across Central Asia, but the wives, mothers, daughters, and widows left behind. Women organized seasonal migrations, oversaw grazing patterns, managed sick animals, directed herders and laborers, tracked livestock numbers with mental precision. A single mistake could cost a clan its future, but Mongol women rarely made them. Their expertise wasn't considered domestic, it was strategic. Without their vigilance, a returning army would have no meat, no leather, no horses, and no empire. Felt, fabric, and feminine industry. Let's look inside the yurt. Every felt panel, every woven rug, every stitched robe was made by women's hands. And felt wasn't just furniture. It insulated yurts in winter. It marked status. It formed horse blankets, cloaks, and even armor linings. Producing it was hard, exhausting work. Shearing the wool, washing and carding it, beating and rolling it into thick layers, using hot water and foot stomping to mat it tightly. Women did this repeatedly, season after season, while managing households, raising children, and keeping trade routes stocked. Their work wasn't decorative, it was infrastructure. Even today, scholars consider felt making one of the most undervalued engines of Mongol expansion. Why? Because it kept everyone warm, mobile, and able to survive. Household management as statecraft. A Mongol household wasn't just the domestic space, it was a microeconomic unit with political consequences. Wives often functioned like administrators. They oversaw slaves and laborers, negotiated food exchanges with nearby clans, recorded debts and obligations, sometimes orally, sometimes on tally sticks, managed surplus goods for trade, supervised seasonal storage and animal redistribution. And when their husbands were away, sometimes for years, these women did it alone, not as placeholders, but as rulers of small mobile economies. Some even grew wealthy in their own right. Historical records from Yuan China mention elite Mongol women managing vast estates, often more efficiently than the men. Trade, tents, and female diplomacy. Mongol women weren't confined to the yurt. They were active participants in trade and diplomacy. They traveled with caravans, bartered at marketplaces, spoke multiple languages, Turkic, Mongolic, Persian, and Chinese, and used marriage and trade together as strategic tools. Some women became trade envoys, negotiating with foreign merchants or emissaries when men were away at war. Others maintained network alliances between families through gifts, textiles, and promised dowries. And yes, some of those gifts were economic in nature: livestock, armor, yurts, or valuable horses. These exchanges weren't female chores, they were empire-sustaining logistics. Salt as food. Let's talk about food, because it wasn't just nourishment, it was power. Mongol women controlled the preparation and distribution of meals, preserved meat and dairy using salt, drying, and fermentation, created travel foods for campaigns like dried curds and horse sausage,
reserved high-status meals for elite gatherings and ritual feasts. They knew how much grain to save, how much kumis to ferment, and which dishes belonged to which guests. Feasting was a diplomatic weapon in the Mongol world. A well-hosted dinner could settle disputes, create alliances, or mark loyalty. And women ran every pot, ladle, and hearth behind those meals. Widows and wealth. Now let's talk about widows. In many medieval cultures, widows lost everything: property, status, identity. But in Mongol society, a widow could become an economic powerhouse. If her husband died, she retained rights to livestock, could manage large households, often acted as regent or matriarch, sometimes remarried strategically to cement alliances, and in elite families could hold land and slaves. Widowhood didn't make a woman invisible, it often made her more powerful. Why? Because she now answered to no one but herself. Some widows were feared, others were revered. All were reminders that economic control did not end with a man's death. Currency, commerce, and adaptation. As the Mongol Empire grew, so did its economic complexity. Eventually, cities required coin, trade routes demanded accounting, foreign economies influenced local customs. Mongol women adapted. Some elite Mongol women minted coins in their own names. Others supervised tribute collection in conquered regions. In Yuan China, women owned shops, managed silk production, and participated in urban economic life. And they didn't do this as exceptions. They did it as a part of a culture where female economic authority was normalized. Cycles of labor, generations of knowledge. Mongol women passed economic knowledge from mother to daughter through memory, repetition, and ritual. There were no manuals, no ledgers, just habit, song, and story. A child learned which goats to breed for winter coats, which spices cured stomach illness, how to recognize signs of animal sickness, how to pack a yurt in under an hour, and how to survive without depending on any man. These were survival lessons, but also economic strategies. Each generation became more skilled, more adaptive, more quietly indispensable. The logistics of empire. Let's zoom out. The Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary. Its armies moved fast, its governance was decentralized, and its stability depended on flexibility. Who kept the gears turning? The women. Not in courts, not in scrolls, but on the ground. They packed wagons, organized water supplies, managed camp rotation, oversaw grain transport, and controlled winter storage, adjusted to sudden climate shifts. While men marched, women maintained. They weren't decorations, they were logisticians of the steppe. Final thought: power without a throne. So what does this all mean? It means that when we picture Genghis Khan, Subutai, or Kublai, we should also picture their mothers, their wives, their daughters, working, counting, breeding horses, stirring pots, stamping felt, trading sheep, feeding soldiers, paying debts, and keeping the world spinning. Because Mongol women were never powerless. They held no crown, but they held the empire in their hands, not in speeches, not in titles, but in quiet mastery of the economy beneath the noise of war. They were the silent backbone, and without them there would have been no empire to conquer with.
Let's sit for a moment. Let the steppe winds settle. Let the hooves fade in the distance. Let the fires die low. And in that quiet, let's ask a simple, patient question. What remains? Not just of the Mongol Empire, its cities, its coins, its conquests, but of the women, the ones who didn't leave chronicles, didn't build monuments, didn't command armies, yet moved the empire from underneath. When the dust cleared and the horses fell silent, what did they leave behind? Let's end this story the way it deserves, with a slow walk through legacy, memory, and the soft power that outlived war. The invisible ink of empire. Historians have a problem. We're trained to look for emperors, generals, battles, treaties. But Mongol women? They lived in the shadows of the archive, rarely named, rarely recorded, often misread. Yet they were everywhere. They were in the folds of every felt yurt, in the calculations behind every herd count, in the ghostly patterns of trade networks, in the very structure of Mongol governance. And though few wrote their names, they wrote with labor, with survival, with structure. It is easy to forget the invisible, but without them the visible empire would have collapsed before it ever began. The architecture of adaptability. The Mongols didn't build stone cities during their rise. They didn't carve temples or inscribe tablets. Their empire was mobile. Their strength lay in adaptation, and that flexibility, that uncanny ability to absorb, adjust, survive. It came from women, because they were the ones who endured harsh climates year after year, balanced seasonal migration with trade and storage, maintained livestock in unpredictable weather, raised adaptable children in fast-changing conditions. They trained generations not in conquest, but in resilience. And when cities eventually came, when courts settled in China and Persia, it was these deep-rooted feminine practices that kept the wheels turning beneath the marble and gold. The hearth as the heart. Historians love to talk about war councils, but the real councils happened in the yurt, around the fire, at night, when women whispered strategy in the ear of a brother, a son, a husband. That hearth was a political center, a school, a command post, a memory vault. Even when the empire stretched thousands of miles, the structure of authority often echoed the structure of the yurt, flexible, circular, decentralized, centered around survival. Women didn't need a palace to rule. They already sat at the warmest, most constant seat of power, the center of the world they built. Legacy through lineage. There's something intimate about Mongol lineage, not just fathers and sons, but mothers and daughters, sisters and cousins, wives and widows. Many powerful male leaders, Genghis Khan, Ögedei, Kublai, owed their success not just to male mentorship, but to maternal guidance. And in many cases, the mother was not just an origin, she was a political actor in her own right. Take Töregene Khatun. After Ögedei's death, she didn't simply disappear. She ruled as regent, negotiated treaties, appointed governors, and held the empire together for nearly 5 years. Her rule wasn't scandalous, it was accepted, expected even. In Mongol tradition, a powerful mother was not unnatural, she was part of the blueprint. Cultural memory without monuments. Unlike Roman matrons or Egyptian queens, Mongol women didn't leave statues. There were no towering inscriptions. So where is their legacy? It's in oral tradition, in the weaving patterns of felt, in the memory of horse herders, in the quiet ways rural Mongol women still arrange their yurts, in the respect many modern Mongol societies still offer to grandmothers and matriarchs. It's not flashy, but it's durable. And that's the point. Their power was never meant to dazzle, it was meant to endure. a legacy still lived. Even today, if you travel the steppes of Mongolia, you'll find women managing herds, coordinating trade, leading nomadic households, teaching survival skills rooted in 13th century practice. The empire may have vanished, the borders may have faded, but the system of survival, the economic logic, the quiet governance of wind and wool, it's still there, passed hand to hand, muttered under breath, stitched into every scrap of felt. The legacy of Mongol women isn't just historical, it's living. Soft power, sharp impact. We often confuse power with visibility, with volume, with violence. But Mongol women teach us something softer, something more dangerous. That real power isn't always declared. It's enacted in daily routines, in family strategy, in resource management. They didn't write laws, they wrote stability. They didn't march to war, they prepared the food, the clothes, the horses that made it possible. And while the men of the empire chased glory, the women built a world that could survive it. Final thoughts. A whispered empire. So, dear listener, let's return to where we began, to a wind-blown yurt, to a woman stirring curds by firelight, to a saddle packed by hands that never held a sword, to an empire carried not just on horses, but in the arms of mothers. We often whisper about history's forgotten women, but the truth is, they never were forgotten, only misplaced. They didn't demand attention. They didn't shout their legacy. They lived it, repeatedly, faithfully, silently. And so we honor them tonight, not with fanfare, but with calm attention. A soft reminder that behind every conquest there is a cook fire, a count of animals, a careful word, a woman who kept things from falling apart. Sleep well knowing this. The fiercest empires may rise by sword, but they are sustained by hands like hers.